September 17th, 2011. The Elwha River, a stretch of canyon on Washington's Olympic Peninsula, where the water has been dammed since 1913. A charge goes off against a concrete face that has held for almost a century. Dust rises over a reservoir that should not exist. And somewhere in the lower river, below where the barrier stood, a Chinook salmon turns upstream and begins to swim. The largest dam removal project in American history has just begun. The engineers had drawn up a 3-year plan. The salmon were not going to wait that long. I have walked a lot of dead rivers. They look alive until you know what to look for. The Elwha looked like a river. The water moved, the canyon was green, and if you didn't know the history, you would think you were standing in a healthy drainage. But above the first dam, there was almost nothing. No spawning beds, no carcasses rotting in the shallows and feeding the forest, no marine nitrogen cycling up from the ocean into the soil. The trees along the upper Elwha had been running a slow deficit for a century, and they had no way to tell you why. I spent 34 years watching this country try to heal itself. Most of what I know, I learned by standing still. I want to tell this one carefully, because the speed of what happened on the Elwha does not fit what I was handed in 34 years of field time. Salmon are patient animals. They follow routes encoded over thousands of years. You damage the habitat, you cut off the access, and recovery is measured in decades. That is the rule. You build up your patience, and most of the time, the long wait is what you get. On the Elwha, the wait was measured in days. The Elwha River drains the north face of the Olympic Mountains into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and before 1913, it was one of the most productive salmon rivers in western Washington. 5 species of Pacific salmon ran its length every fall: Chinook, coho, sockeye, pink, and chum. The runs moved 70 miles into the mountains, feeding bears and eagles and the entire riparian forest along the way. The lower Elwha Clallam tribe had lived along this river for thousands of years. Their treaty with the United States, signed in 1855, explicitly preserved their right to fish at their usual and accustomed places. The Elwha was one of those places. The 5 salmon species that ran the Elwha were not interchangeable to the Clallam people. The fall Chinook were the largest, the most prized, the ones that filled the river in numbers that earlier generations described in ways that sound like exaggeration now, but are supported by the biological record. The river's salmon fed not only the people, but the forest itself. Bears carried carcasses up the bank and left them among the roots. The nitrogen in those fish, nitrogen drawn from the ocean and transported 70 miles inland by bodies weighing 30 pounds or more, was in the trees. When the dam stopped the salmon, they did not only stop a food source. They stopped the nutrient delivery system that the entire watershed had been built around for thousands of years. The salmon ceremony the lower Elwha Clallam held at the start of the fishing season is an obligation, older than the dam, older than the treaty, built around the physical fact of salmon moving upstream through water that belonged to them. By the middle of the 20th century, it had to be held in the lower 5 miles of the river. The Chinook that had once run all the way to the headwaters were gone from most of the watershed. The people still lived on the river. The river had been taken from them in the only way that mattered. The dam builder's arrangement, the thing that would later become the exact legal and moral liability that brought both structures down, was this: he never built a fish ladder. Washington state law required one. Thomas Aldwell negotiated around the requirement, made assurances that were never honored, and poured the concrete anyway. What seemed like a pragmatic workaround in 1913 would become, 9 decades later, the precise vulnerability his successors could not defend. But in 1913, it was celebrated as progress. The Elwha Dam was 108 feet of concrete across a river that had fed people for generations, and it had no passage for fish. For a while, the economic logic held. The dam generated power. The city of Port Angeles had electricity. The runs below the dam continued, diminished but present, and anyone who was not watching the river closely would not have seen what was being lost. That didn't last. The Glines Canyon Dam went in 14 years later, in 1927. 210 feet of concrete, built on federal land without the tribe's consent and without fish passage. Together, the two structures reduced the salmon's accessible habitat from 70 miles down to less than 5. 65 miles of mountain river closed to fish. The Klallam people watched the runs above the dam site disappear within a generation, and then watched the runs below it follow. That's not a typo, by the way. The tribe filed complaints. They requested fish ladders through every available administrative channel. They were declined repeatedly. The power contracts took precedence. The structures were too established. But the runs continued to decline, and hatchery programs launched downstream to compensate could not restore what the river had lost. Hatchery fish are not wild fish. They do not do what wild salmon do for a river. They produce a harvest that obscures the absence of something older. The Point-No-Point Treaty of 1855 was one of a series of agreements in which the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest ceded large portions of their territory to the United States in exchange for explicit guarantees. The right to continue fishing at their usual and accustomed places, in common with the citizens of the territory. That phrase was interpreted for the next century as meaning the tribes could seek access alongside commercial interests. The treaty language was treated as accommodation. By the time the courts began to read those words more carefully, in the treaty rights cases of the 1970s and beyond, the salmon runs the treaties had been written to protect had already been declining for decades throughout the Pacific Northwest. On the Elwha, the runs above the dams had been gone since the 1920s. The legal right was still on paper. The fish were not. If you're wondering how that was even legal for nearly a century, so is everyone who has read the history carefully. The answer is that it happened incrementally, that the legal mechanisms for enforcing treaty rights against major infrastructure took decades to develop, and that by the time the question of removal was being seriously discussed, the concrete had been there for 50 years, and the economic interests around it were deeply settled. The negotiation that finally produced the removal agreement was not a single fight. It was a sequence of legal and administrative proceedings across more than a decade. The dam operator ran the numbers on what it would cost to upgrade the aging structures to meet modern fish passage requirements. Those numbers were unfavorable. The tribe's legal team argued that no fish passage system could restore what the treaty had guaranteed, that the only remedy was full removal. Federal agencies eventually agreed. The relicensing process for the upper dam, which came up for renewal in the 1990s, became the legal fulcrum. The agreement that emerged required not just removal, but a comprehensive restoration of the river corridor, including revegetation of the exposed reservoir beds and ongoing monitoring of fish populations for decades after completion. The Lower Elwha Klallam tribe was a full partner in designing the plan. Most people never heard about this part. The discussions were not loud. They were procedural, consequential, and largely invisible to anyone not directly involved. The argument that had seemed radical in the 1970s was the official plan by the early 2000s. The cost of the project came to approximately $350 million, funded by Congress. That's the kind of number that makes you pause. $350 million to undo what two structures had cost a fraction of that to build 90 years earlier. But the accounting now included what the original builders had never priced: the restoration of the river's biological function, the treaty obligations deferred for a century, and the slow erosion of the river's delta, which had been losing sediment for decades because the upstream supply was cut off. The people who built those dams in 1913 and 1927 could not have priced a century of compounding loss. But the calculation they made, that industrial power was worth the biological trade-off, was about to be renegotiated with a very different ledger. Everything those dams had built, the power capacity, the settled assumption that a river could simply be managed around its natural function, was about to be weighed against what they had actually cost. The plan called for staged removal over 3 years. They would lower the reservoirs gradually, take the Elwha Dam down in controlled sections, then move to Glines Canyon. The sediment trapped behind the dams, an estimated 24 million cubic yards of it, had to be allowed to work downstream in stages, so the estuary at the river's mouth would not be overwhelmed. The biologists managing the recovery were careful in their expectations. The team's optimistic scenarios suggested salmon might begin recolonizing accessible reaches within a few years of the project's completion. Privately, some of the fisheries staff were more conservative. Nobody had removed dams this size before. The Elwha was going to be the template. The monitoring protocols they established assumed that meaningful fish recolonization would take years to document. Then, on the morning of September 17, 2011, the first charges went into the Elwha Dam. The reservoir began to drop. The river, which had not moved freely past this point in nearly 100 years, began to find its old channel. The monitoring team settled in for what they expected to be a long watch. The cameras were positioned along the channel. The instruments were calibrated. The water was cloudy with released sediment. But what you have probably heard about this project, if you have heard anything at all, does not include what happened first. Within days of demolition beginning on the lower dam, Chinook salmon were observed moving into stretches of river above the old dam site. Wild adult fish. Moving upstream into gravel beds that no salmon had touched since before the First World War. They had not waited for the project to finish. They had not waited for the sediment plume to clear, for the habitat to be assessed, or for the biologists to confirm that conditions were suitable. The moment the barrier was low enough, the fish came. And no, I'm not making that up. Think about what that means for a moment. A population of salmon that had been blocked from those upstream reaches for nearly a century retained the orientation to find them the moment access returned. The fish had never been there. Their parents had never been there. And yet within days, they were moving upstream looking for gravel. But the salmon had much further to go. The Chinook came first. Steelhead followed. By 2012, with the lower dam fully removed and work on Glines Canyon still in progress, bull trout were documented above the upper dam site, in water they had not occupied since the 1920s. Bull trout are indicators. They require cold, clean, undisturbed habitat. You do not get them in a river that is not ready. The Elwha was not fully ready. The bull trout came anyway. By 2014, when the last section of Glines Canyon Dam was removed and the Elwha ran free for the first time in 87 years, all 5 Pacific salmon species had been documented somewhere in the newly accessible river. 70 miles of mountain habitat, closed for nearly a century, being explored by fish while the removal machinery was still running. Up to that point, restoration ecology had been built on patient timelines. You remove the stressor, you monitor carefully, and you wait years for the system to respond. The Elwha ran against that assumption. It suggested that salmon do not simply recolonize habitat when it becomes available. They find it. Quickly. The genetic or behavioral memory of a river survives in a population even when the river has been inaccessible for generations, and when access opens, the fish know. So, the fish came back fast. But what the salmon did to the river after they arrived made the speed of their return look like the least interesting part. Salmon are not just fish. They are a delivery system from ocean to mountain. Every adult that spawns in an upstream gravel bed and dies there carries marine nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon from the sea into the forest. Eagles take the carcasses. Bears drag them into the trees. Rain washes the residue into the soil. Coastal Pacific rainforest evolved around this input for thousands of years. The trees along the upper Elwha had been running a nutrient deficit for nearly a century, and there was no way to fill it without fish. By 2015, vegetation surveys along the newly exposed reservoir beds were showing faster riparian recovery than the planners had projected. Willows and cottonwoods were colonizing the sediment. Alders were fixing nitrogen. The streamside zone was measurably changing in ways that would take another decade to fully describe. The river's delta at the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which had been eroding for decades because the upstream sediment supply was cut off, began to rebuild. The beach at the river's mouth grew wider. Things that had been going in one direction for nearly a century started going the other way. If the project had only been measured by the physical removal of the concrete, it would have seemed like a success with an uncertain future. But the fish made it something else. They drove the nutrient cycle that drove the vegetation, which drove the soil, which fed everything above it. The recovery was not designed. It was cascading. And the cascade was moving faster than any model had projected. The lower Elwha Clallam tribe held their first traditional ceremony for salmon in the upper river in more than a century. Fish in a place their grandparents had been prevented from fishing. A ceremony with something to return to. What survived the Elwha is not only a salmon run. What survived is a demonstration that a river's memory outlasts the structures built across it. The fish arrived before the habitat was ready. They came before the sediment cleared, before the gravel fully settled, before the assessment teams had finished measuring. The river did not need to be healed to call them back. It only needed to be open. The runs on the Elwha are still growing. The ecosystem along the upper river is measurably different than it was in 2010. Still healing. Still different from 1913. But moving. And moving in the direction that 100 years of concrete had prevented. The models were wrong in the optimistic direction. And in 34 years of watching these systems, I have not encountered that outcome very often. I spent 34 years watching this country try to heal itself. Most of what I know, I learned by standing still. The Elwha taught me something I had not fully expected. Sometimes the land knows the way back before we do. Sometimes the only thing required of us is to stop blocking it. If stories like this one are why you're here, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And drop a comment below. What's a river or a wild place near you that you have seen trying to come back? I read every one. One more thing. If the Elwha got you thinking about what happens when a body of water gets its path back, there is a story on this channel about a sea that was declared dead for 30 years. Kazakhstan built one dam across what was left of it. 7 months later, the fish came back. Tap it on the screen right now.